Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Business in 2021 webinar presentation. My name is Kathy Purdy, and I'm the Marketing Manager at Schoeneck King. Just two quick housekeeping items to go over before we get started. Please enter your questions using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address those as time allows. Once today's webinar has ended, we would appreciate it if you would take a moment to complete the brief survey. Your comments and suggestions are important to our panelists and provide us with topics for future presentations. So it's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Andy Bobrick.
Kathy, thank you. Good to be with you, everyone. We have another great program today. There has been a bunch going on here in New York that HR folks who have HR responsibilities are paying close attention to, I'm sure. And we want to cover a few of those things today. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Teresa Rusnak, I did just want to put a quick plug in with respect to the New York Zero Act. I think I share some, I guess, concerns, not the right word, but I don't think we're hearing as much as we might have expected from our clients on this issue. As many questions, as much discussion. Maybe that's simply a feature of people adopting the model policies and putting them on the shelf for the time being. Of course, that hasn't been, plans have not been enacted yet or enforced yet. That may change, but just a plug for folks, if you have not adopted your plan as of yet, the deadline was last week. You're going to want to do that. And also the clock is ticking on communicating with employees about that plan. If you have questions or need assistance with that, please reach out to your favorite bond attorney or any of the panel members here. We'd be happy to help you with that. Okay, I'd like to turn it over to Teresa Rusnak. As I'm sure everybody knows here on this webinar, last week, the Attorney General's office released the investigative report of the sexual harassment allegations made against Governor Cuomo. The report was very lengthy, 160 some odd pages with very extensive appendices attached to it. For someone like me and my colleagues here who practice in this area, we of course were interested to review that report and the approach taken in that. And having had the opportunity to do that, Teresa wanted to talk to folks today and go into some detail in terms of what can we learn from how this report was prepared, how the investigation was conducted. I think there are some good lessons that Teresa is going to convey to you. And also it's a good opportunity just to go over some of the key elements when we are conducting an investigation. Again, I think we'll see more of these issues continue to persist in the future here. And as you know, New York has amended its sexual harassment laws, lowering the bar and the standard for what constitutes actionable harassment, and really placing a key premium on thorough and comprehensive investigations being conducted in the workplace. So with that, Teresa, great to have you today. Take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Andy alluded to, and as I'm sure you've seen all over both the local, state, and national news, the governor's sexual harassment the allegations into sexual harassment by the governor were substantiated by the report of the Attorney General and her team on August 3rd. So ever since then, we've been dealing with the report. It is lengthy, as Andy mentioned, but essentially the investigators found that Governor Cuomo violated multiple state and federal laws, as well as the executive chamber's own policies. I mean, I think that's a good place to start, right? So when as Andy said, I'm going to be giving some tips for conducting investigations. And I think one of the first things you want to think about when conducting an investigation is what are the potential laws and policies at stake here, right? So as Andy alluded to, the New York State standard for sexual harassment, and not just sexual harassment, but harassment based on race or religion or any of the other protected categories, is more permissive than the federal standard. Back in 2019, as part of the Me Too movement, New York State changed its standard for sexual harassment and basically changed it to any conduct that affects a person's terms, conditions, or privileges of employment and rises above the level of a petty, slight, or trivial inconvenience. And that's a lot more permissive than the federal standard for hostile work environment or harassment, which needs to be severe and or pervasive enough that a reasonable person would find the environment to be hostile or abusive on the basis of sex or race or whatever. So the New York standard is a lot more permissive, and it's in a twist of fate. Governor Cuomo was one of the people who was advocating for the more permissive standard for New York employers, and now it seems he is in violation of the standard that he advocated for, as well as the federal standard and the executive chamber's own policies. So those are kind of the world you would like to keep in mind, not just for the governor, but any employer who's looking at a sexual harassment or any other type of harassment investigation. Was the state law violated? Was the federal law violated? And were the policies of the entity itself violated? Many employers have policies that are even stricter than what the state or federal government would consider to be harassment. So it's always important to look at those three elements when you're investigating any type of sexual harassment claim. Next slide, please. So some other takeaways for employers, I think we've seen from the report and other serious allegations made in the media over the years against other prominent figures, that complaints should be taken seriously at the time they're made. You can always investigate a complaint later, but it's better to investigate it contemporaneously because witnesses move on, people forget, for all the reasons that you should investigate something contemporaneously. It's a good reason to do that with sexual harassment claims. Information needs to be preserved, including electronic information and text messages. As Andy alluded to, the governor's report included a tremendous amount of information, including electronic information. And as employers conducting these investigations or having someone conduct them on your behalf, you're going to want to make sure that information is preserved from the beginning and preserved going back as far as the matter is relevant to your company. You'll also want to make sure you're appointing the correct person to conduct the investigation. As we know with the Attorney General's report, the Attorney General contracted other attorneys to help her with the investigation, and that's not all that unusual. On the more local employer level, if you will, you have to consider who in your organization is going to conduct the investigation. Will it be human resources? Will it be a compliance officer? Will it be someone of that nature? Or are you going to ask an outside party like a law firm or an investigation firm to conduct the investigation into sexual harassment? And there are different considerations that go into that. Sometimes when higher level individuals at the company or entity are involved, you tend to engage outside counsel to handle the investigation. Or if HR usually does the investigation, but the investigation is about human resources, then in those cases you want to look for someone else to do the investigation. As far as multiple investigators go, I think it's a good policy, maybe not to have multiple investigators per se, but to certainly have two people sit in on interviews and conversations when you can, just to corroborate that and to make sure that the facts are straight. Next slide, please. So another thing employers can consider is interim measures during the investigation. So sometimes when the complaint is made, employers will put employees on leave pending the outcome of the investigation. That can be paid, that can be unpaid. It depends on the employer's policies and sometimes the types of allegations at stake as well. Other interim measures include transferring one of the parties. That if you have two people working together and one's made a complaint about the other, you can maybe transfer one of those people to a different shift or to a different location until the investigation is resolved. But please make sure when you're doing that carefully and with the permission and consent of the parties involved, so it doesn't look like retaliation. As we've learned from the governor and from other examples of sexual harassment, it is important to keep in mind the potential impact of power dynamics. I can't emphasize enough how much that's come into play with the AG's report. Always be mindful of supervisors using their authority for nefarious reasons, including for the possibility of retaliation. It's always important during investigations to remind supervisors that retaliation is illegal. It's also prohibited by the organization's policies, and that essentially retaliation, even if the complaint is found to be not valid, retaliation can get the employer in trouble in a whole different way. As employers, you want to make consistent disciplinary decisions. And what that really means is that similarly situated people should be treated similarly. You don't want to treat someone differently in the outcome of an investigation because of their race or their gender, or even something not necessarily protected like their position in the company. You want to make sure to treat people consistently. It's when you don't treat people consistently that you start getting into the realm of potential retaliation, or perhaps even a different type of discrimination claim in and of itself. Next slide, Kath. And then finally, I wanted to talk about some credibility determinations. So when I do investigations, credibility is always a big issue, especially in cases where it might be he said, she said, or she said. And so credibility is always a question, how do we determine who is telling the truth? And I think it's important when you're doing an investigation not to shy away from credibility determinations. And some factors that you can use to assess credibility include plausibility. Does it make sense that this happened the way the person is saying it happened? Is this what a reasonable person would do or say in this situation? Demeanor and body language. Certainly, we all know that when people are not being truthful, they tend to have some physical affect to that. They don't look you in the eye. They repeat themselves. They don't generally look truthful. Is there a motive to falsify? Is this person going to gain something by lying to you in this investigation? And maybe what they're gaining is not being disciplined. That's always something to consider. Corroboration, very important. And I think we saw this a lot in the AG's report. Is there someone else that can corroborate either what happened or has a contemporaneous disclosure of what happened? So did the person who made the complaint disclose these allegations to someone at the time that they were made? Contemporaneous disclosures, while not as good as a first-hand witness, are always helpful in these situations because it shows that the person isn't making up the story after the fact for some other purpose. Is there a past record? Has this person engaged in conduct similar to this before? Is there a pattern? I would add to that. Are there contradictions in the person's narrative or inconsistencies that don't make sense? And then just things like defensiveness, hostility, tone, volume. Is the person angry? Is the person being evasive? Are they unwilling to answer? Are they giving vague replies? Those are all things that you can look at to determine credibility. And as I said earlier, do they have motive to lie? Do they have motive to falsify? Do they have a motive to not tell you as the investigator the truth in this situation? So those are all things I think you can take away from not just the AG's report, but from general good practices for investigating sexual harassment complaints. And now I'm going to turn it back to Andy, who, if I've been watching the chat out of the corner of my eye, is going to turn it to Katie, because I think the Albany News just got first billing.
That's right.
Yeah, that is correct. And I don't want to delay things, turn over to Katie, but Teresa, thanks for that overview. And I guess if I have one takeaway, and I know it's something that you've emphasized too with clients in the past, is not to shy away from making those credibility determinations. If you read the report on the governor's, the allegations against the governor, credibility was absolutely key throughout that report, and the investigators made determinations. They did so based on their observations and other objective evidence. And oftentimes, this is key in an investigation. And we can't necessarily throw our hands up in the air in an investigation because we have two parties saying different things that don't line up. We can make those determinations, and often we should make those determinations. So that's not a bad segue, I guess, to Katie Anderson and her update. Katie, I know you've been continuing to monitor matters closely in Albany, and as I understand it, some breaking news just a minute ago.
That's correct. The governor has resigned. We have broken a lot of history, I think, on these webinars. This one may be the most significant breaking news or historical moment that we have dealt with on this webinar. But Governor Andrew Cuomo has resigned. His resignation will be effective in 14 days. At that time, the Lieutenant Governor, Kathy Hochul, she will become the governor. She will be the first woman to be governor of New York State. She is from Buffalo, New York. She has been involved in politics for her entire life. And the main change that will be occurring is that she will have to reissue all of the executive orders that are currently in effect. Those will expire with the end of his administration. There are other certain leadership issues that will also have to be taken care of, namely changes to the MTA. Those administrators will have to be, they end with the end of an administration. This is technically the end of an administration. The lead up to this resignation, which remember a week ago, we broke that the AG report came out, so it took 7 days to get here. The lead up to this resignation was the governor's personal attorney spending about 45 minutes giving a speech about how the Attorney General report was false or misleading. And then the governor spending about 7 minutes of his own speech doing the same thing, and then ultimately resigning. So this is major news. This will have major implications across the state. But the good news is that hopefully we can return to seeing functioning government. We have been lacking a lot of that in the past week, especially as we saw with what happened with schools last week with the Department of Health saying that they will not be issuing guidance regarding school reopening, despite saying earlier in the year that they would be and that schools would have to follow their guidance. That led to a remarkable comeback from the commissioner of the Department of Education, saying that it was the Department of Health's statutory duty to provide such guidance. So we've seen a ton of infighting here in Albany in the past week. It was a particularly nasty week, and I don't expect that the next 2 weeks are going to be anything. They will not be smooth sailing in any way, shape, or form here in Albany. It's likely going to be quite ugly over the next 2 weeks, but we will continue to see the fallout. I imagine that we will see quite a bit of turnover in terms of administration officials, top administration officials. Absolutely, you will see people moving, but also commissioners and heads of other departments within the state government. Remember, New York is such an expansive state government that, and the governor has really taken control of that government over the past 10 years in a unprecedented way. So to see how this folds out will be very newsworthy at the very least. But turning to who the governor will be, Kathy Hochul, again, she is from Buffalo. She has been involved in politics for most of her life. She served as a clerk out in Buffalo. She was a county clerk. She also was a member of the House of Representatives for 2 years before her district was changed with redistricting. She is a moderate Democrat from Western New York. It will be the first time in a very long time that New York has had a governor that is not from the New York City area. That will obviously present some interesting challenges to her in the next year if she plans on running for re-election. Her term would be ending on December 31st of 2022. So next year will be an election year for the governor's office, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And this will all be weighing very heavily, but the best thing that she has going for her is that she has been kept at a very far arm's length away from the governor for years. She has really never been involved in the budget process. She was never involved in any of the COVID briefings. She was never mentioned in the governor's COVID book that was published last year. So that will likely be of benefit to her because she is very different personally from him in how she acts. She's very much more Midwestern in how she acts with people versus downstate New York type of a way. remember Buffalo is closer to Cleveland than it is to New York City. So very, very different types of vibes that we will be seeing going into the governor's office. With that, let's turn and look at what's happening with COVID in New York. Most of this I'm going to be going over statistics and things, but again, I think we will continue to see a lot of the mandates in the next few weeks coming from towns, counties across New York State. So continue to be looking at those places and continue to monitor your local situations for what is happening. We continue to see increase in cases in New York State. The Delta variant really is not a joke at this point. When you look at the case numbers coming out of Florida, it is quite concerning. But first, let's look at New York. New York, we've seen hospitalizations increase 53% over the past 14 days. Since the beginning of July, we've seen a 200% increase in hospitalizations in New York. The number of cases is about the level that it was last February. Obviously not good news, but in good news, we have seen, the rate of death has remained low in New York. While there has been a 77% change in increase in the amount of deaths over the past 14 days, there have been 10 deaths associated with COVID. So again, while that is horrible news, it is good news in that it is not hundreds of deaths that are occurring. Looking at cases by region, the Northeast is that red line at the bottom. So the Northeast remains to be the place to be in terms of COVID. There are not many cases happening compared to the rest of the country. Next, you have the Midwest, then you have the West, then you have the South, and then you have Florida all by itself. Florida is a straight line up in the air at the moment in terms of how its caseload is increasing. They are almost to, they're around like 150 cases per 100,000 people. Obviously, that is a much higher case rate than there has been throughout the country at any point in this pandemic, as you can see on this map. So that is really a frightening thing to take a look at. And luckily, I don't have to cover what's happening in Florida, because if I did, we would be here all day with the drama that's happening there. It makes New York look, like child's play. In terms of vaccination progress in New York, we are continuing to see the vaccination progress increasing. 58% fully vaccinated, 64% have received one dose. 18 and older, we're looking at 77% have received one dose, and 69% are fully vaccinated. All of those ticked up by 1 percentage point versus last week. The update, there's a major update regarding Pfizer. Pfizer is likely to be fully approved by the FDA in mid-September. Once that occurs, it is likely we will see a lot of vaccine mandates become, we'll see a lot more. We've already seen a lot, and once that becomes, I think a lot more places will be more comfortable mandating. Additionally, the booster for immunocompromised people is likely to happen this week. The FDA has said that they have looked at Pfizer's data about how a third shot does help people with who have received organ transplants or other types of immunocompromised issues, and that the booster does help them fight against the Delta variant. The CDC also released a very interesting statistic today that showed that 99.99% of the hospitalizations that are occurring right now across the country are unvaccinated individuals. So that is also very good news about the efficacy of these vaccines. Looking at the vaccine or mask mandates that are occurring in New York City, I briefly touched on this last week, but New York City is requiring that by mid-September, you have to be fully vaccinated for indoor dining, gyms, and entertainment. In terms of your military, looking at active duty personnel must be fully vaccinated by mid-September. Right now, a little over 60% of active duty personnel are fully vaccinated. So obviously that will get to 100 by mid-September. The thought process to that is it is a national security concern that if those soldiers are activated, as they are active duty, and they are sick, then they're not going to be able to serve their positions. And finally, 3 states have mask mandates now: Louisiana, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C. Not a state, but whatever, we'll take it. So there are mask mandates there. Again, very unlikely we will see a full-on mask mandate in New York again, but it is still required under regulation that have that unvaccinated people in New York State have to be masked when they are outside or in public or inside. These are the counties in New York State that the CDC is under the CDC guidance. Everyone should be wearing masks while indoors. As you can see, as I was unhappy to see this morning, Rensselaer, Albany, all of these counties where I live have moved into the high rate of spread. So we went from substantial to high over here. And so again, you have to be looking at your specific counties to see, and your towns too, and cities, to see what's being mandated there. I saw something with Broome County, Monroe County has some things. A lot of these places are requiring masks in public buildings, but keep your eyes out for what's happening in your towns and counties. That will be very important. Again, if you don't have a subscription to your local newspaper, strongly advise you to get a subscription to that. That'll be very important. So I left this slide intentionally blank, pretty blank, because I figured something would be cooking before the today. So that's it from me in Albany. Again, we're all going to take some time to process what's happening and take a look around at what needs to be done. But with that, I'm sure I'll have a lot more to say next week, as I always do. So I'll kick it over to you, Andy.
Katie, thanks. As always, we appreciate you staying on top of these issues. And, not the first time we're analyzing and commenting on news that's breaking while we're presenting this. Certainly changes ahead with respect to the administration. As the 4 of us presenting here today have worked under this administration for the majority of our legal careers, this is going to be a big deal. I think there's going to be a lot of change. It's going to trickle down to the local level, to your everyday work as human resources professionals and business leaders. And obviously, we're going to stay on top of it and continue to report. And again, not a bad segue. Here to talk to Aaron Torsello. As folks know, Aaron's a regular participant here on our weekly webinars. A good friend of mine, somebody I work with very closely and have the pleasure to do so. And, Aaron and I were talking the other day, and we're starting to get calls again from clients who are having employees or employee spouses test positive for COVID. And the question is one that, thinking back, Aaron, right? We faced 12 months ago, or even longer ago. What do we do? What do we do now? So Aaron wanted to come on and talk a little bit about that issue and what folks should keep in mind as we're seeing these rates, and we keep in mind Katie's charts, and we're seeing the numbers go up. How do we handle the situation in what was supposed to be the post-COVID era, but yet we're still in the midst of COVID, it seems. So Aaron, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Andy. And thank you for putting me after Katie, because who's going to want to listen to this after that groundbreaking news? I'm getting, my phone is blowing up. I'm getting all these text messages.
I'm here.
Might just
Aaron,
be me.
I'm here too. I want to listen to it.
Yeah, you got two of us.
All right. So as Andy mentioned, I've been talking to Andy and some of our colleagues in the labor group, and very much of what's happening now feels like we are back in March, April, May of 2020. We're in this position where there's not a whole lot of, you have to do X, Y, and Z. So many employers are navigating very similar issues to what we had last spring, without a whole lot of definites in terms of mandates. And so to Katie's point, what I wanted to talk about today was, how do we navigate You're calling the post-COVID phase, Andy. I'm going to use a hockey analogy. It's like we're in the third period of COVID, right? But the third period looks a lot like the first period, where there weren't a lot of mandates. The second period, the state told us exactly what we needed to do. While there were frustrations with that in terms of the number of, things that we were obligated to do if we were an essential business in order to be open, or as things began reopening in the fall, the measures that we had to institute within our workplaces, we don't have that anymore. But now without all of that, I think we are struggling to figure out what we should be doing. And so, like I said, and as Andy mentioned, we're getting a number of calls walking through very similar issues about, what we had last year in terms of if we're open, what are our obligations? To Katie's point, it is unlikely that we will see any more mandates from the state. And this is going to be county by county, city by city, town by town, village by village. I'm here in Buffalo. So first, I'm very excited to have Kathy Hochul take over as governor. I've had a number of interactions with her just in my work out in the community on some boards that I sit on. And I think she's fantastic. So I'm excited about that on a personal level. But to that point, for at least the next 2 weeks until this transition occurs, I think Katie would agree that we are certain to see no changes in terms of mandates from the state, regardless of what happens in numbers. Nothing is going to happen, which means that for at least the next 2 weeks, we are looking at our county executives, town supervisors, village mayors, whatever the case may be, to really guide any mandates that we may be seeing. And that's okay. So to Katie's point, here in Erie County, Mark Poloncarz has been, very vocal about what the expectation is. Given our vaccination rate here in Erie County and given where our caseload is, it's unlikely that the county will issue any mandates, but that might change in various towns or other local municipalities. So keep your eye out for that. As we move forward, so if you're operating in a whether at the county, city, whatever level you're at, without a mandate, then really the obligation is up to you as an employer to figure out what works best for your operation in terms of masking, vaccination, social distancing. Because there are no mandates, you got to think about what works best for your organization. To do that, you may be working with your local county Department of Health. So to Andy's point about what do we do if we have a positive case in the workforce, so we no longer really have a roadmap. Instead, I think we are going to have to work closely with the county health department to figure out who are close contacts, what their advice is in terms of close contacts having to quarantine. Is the person vaccinated versus unvaccinated? There are going to be a lot of issues that you'll be navigating, but it will likely be with your local county health department as opposed to having a mandate from the state. Once there's transition at the governor's level, we may see something at that point. We just don't know yet. So for right now, the focus should be on what our local municipalities are telling us we have to do. There also is there are no mandates from the federal side of things. All we have are the CDC guidance and OSHA's guidance about safe workplaces. So you can certainly use those as guiding what your policies are going to be, but our policies are no longer dictated by mandates, but instead we have more discretion to determine what makes sense for our workplaces in light of some of those factors we talked about before. What industry we're in. Are we customer facing? Do we have a large amount of the public coming through our facilities? So for example, here in Erie County, all of our county buildings require masks, but most stores do not still. So it really depends on where you're going to be located as to what your obligations are. In terms of vaccine mandates, this is going to be a question. Very often do we as Labor Council say, well, you have a lot of discretion to do kind of what you want, depending on what your business requires. But that's where we're at right now. So what I would suggest is, as you are developing your policies during this third period of COVID, which hopefully there's no overtime, the game ends at the end of the third period, work with your council to figure out what might work best for your organization. Keep in mind that you may be dealing with, if you have facilities across the state or across state lines, that you may be dealing with mandates or lack thereof at the local level as opposed to the state level. So pay closer attention to what's happening at the county, city, village, town level. And with that, like I said, start to reach out to your favorite bond attorney or labor and employment counsel to have these further discussions as you're building out your policies. And with that, Andy, I will turn it back to you.
All right, Erin, thank you. Very, very helpful guidance there. And maybe I can just piggyback very quickly before we wrap on, I think, the overall point here. We've dealt with a lot of guidance. This guidance changed. There were recommendations and requirements. And my sense is that there was a measure of comfort for those of you on this webinar that we had a path to follow. A couple of comments. One, that the guidance wasn't always clear, right, on its face. Left a number of questions that you had to resolve, and you were able to resolve it. Two, it always didn't fit our industry or our particular workplace. It had gaps that we had to fill in and decisions that we had to make. And fortunately, we've made progress with the pandemic. Yes, we're seeing emergence with the Delta variant. We're having issues and questions with respect to vaccination of workers. But we're in a position, I think, where we want to be as an organization. And that's where we have lessons that we've learned. We have a lot of information and data that we've gathered through this pandemic. Our operations have continued. We've made decisions along the way. And now we're going to be in a position to continue to evaluate information and make decisions that are in the best interest of our organization or our business. And again, I submit to you that that's where we want to be at the end of the day, to have that type of control. Yes, we're going to need to work with our local officials. Yes, we'll monitor guidance from the states and feds to keep those points in mind and adhere to if necessary. But again, the answers are out there, the paths are out there. Work with your teams, work with your labor council and your employment council and your bond council and other issues. We can help you with those things, but again, I think this is ultimately could be a good place to be to help protect organizations and position us well moving forward. So with that, I'll thank our panelists today. Thank you to all our attendees for being here. Our contact information is right up there. If we can help you with anything, let us know. Be safe and be well, everybody. We'll see you next week.